I want to start by telling you what my role in Falcott was, because my role is the reason I was the person who noticed what I noticed and then did what I did with it. I am 42 years old. I have lived in Falcott, Kentucky my whole life, except for 4 years at a state university in Bowling Green, where I studied electrical engineering and then came back home because Falcott was where I was from and where I intended to stay. I work as an electrician, my own small operation, and I serve as the communications officer for the Falcott Volunteer Fire Department, which means I am responsible for maintaining the department's radio equipment and serving as the relay point between our department and the county emergency management system during active incidents. I am also a licensed amateur radio operator and a member of the county's Amateur Radio Emergency Service Group, which means that during significant disasters, I am one of the people who keeps communication flowing when the regular infrastructure fails. All of this is to say that I am more connected to the official emergency communication systems for our county and surrounding region than most people in Falcott are. I monitor feeds that most residents do not know exist. I have contacts at the State Emergency Management Office in Frankfurt. I know how the alert system is supposed to work because I have spent 15 years working adjacent to it. I know what a correctly issued alert looks like. I know what a targeting error looks like. What came through on a Thursday evening in March of last year was neither of those things, and it took me 6 months to understand why. Falcott is a small town in western Kentucky, about 2,200 people, sitting in the flat farm country between the Tennessee border and the land between the lake's recreation area. It is the kind of town that has been exactly what it is for a long time, not growing and not shrinking, just continuing, with the specific stability of a place that has found its equilibrium with the land around it and sees no particular reason to change it. I have always loved that about Falcott, the continuity of it, the sense of a community that knows what it is and has known for a long time. On that Thursday evening, I was in my shop, finishing up some work on a panel that needed to be ready for a job site the following morning. I had the fire department radio on the workbench running as background monitoring, which I always did during the severe weather season, and I had my phone on the bench beside it and the weather radio in the corner of the shop. It was a quiet evening, nothing active on any of the feeds, and I was focused on the panel work. Then every device I had that was connected to the alert system went off at once. My phone, the fire department radio, the weather radio in the corner, all of them at the same moment. The emergency alert system tone, the layered, urgent sound of an official message coming through the system simultaneously on every channel. I have heard that sound hundreds of times in 15 years of communications work, and it produces the same response every time, the immediate full attention that the system is designed to produce. I picked up my phone. The alert was categorized as a civil emergency message. The geographic targeting showed Falcott and the surrounding county area. The issuance time was current. The source code was valid. All of that was exactly as it should be. The text was not. It said, residents within 2 miles of the Harwell Industrial Complex and those in proximity to the Cutter Creek drainage are advised to shelter in place immediately. Do not use tap water from municipal sources. Do not open windows or exterior doors. Remain indoors until this message is cancelled. This advisory is in effect due to a civil emergency condition in the affected area. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, the way I read things when my first reading and my second reading have not resolved into the same understanding. The Harwell Industrial Complex did not exist in Falcott. There was no such complex anywhere in our county that I was aware of. Cutter Creek did not exist. We had a waterway called Mill Branch that ran through the eastern part of town, and we had Borden Creek 6 miles to the south, but no Cutter Creek anywhere in the county geography that I knew. The alert was giving the people of Falcott instructions for a place that was not Falcott. I called Doug, the County Emergency Management Director, immediately. Doug and I had worked alongside each other for years, and he picked up on the second ring the way he always picked up during active alerts, because Doug treated an active alert as an active alert regardless of what he had been doing before it came through. He said he had already been getting calls. He said the alert was a targeting error. It had been issued by the Emergency Management Office in Caldwell County, about 40 miles to our east, and it had been geographically targeted to a specific industrial corridor in their county. Through a technical error in the targeting parameters, it had gone to our county as well. He said the Caldwell County office had already been notified, and the alert would be cancelled shortly, and residents should disregard it. He apologized for the confusion and said he would put out a clarifying statement through the county's public information channels. I thanked him and hung up. I stood in my shop with the phone in my hand, and I looked at the alert text still visible on the screen, and I thought about two things at the same time. The first thing was that the eastern part of Falcott had an old industrial site, a farm chemical manufacturing plant that operated from the 1940s until it closed in the early 1980s, about 40 years of operation, and the land it sat on had been vacant ever since. Everyone in Falcott knew about it in the vague and distant way that people knew about old industrial sites in their towns. As a feature of the local geography, with some unspecified history attached to it. The site sat about 1.5 miles from the center of town, on what was locally called the Old Hardin Road. It had a chain-link fence around it, and some county environmental services notices at the gate and 40 years of scrub growth over the old foundations. The second thing was that Mill Branch, which ran through the eastern part of Falcott, ran within 1/4 mile of the old plant site before continuing through the residential areas on the east side of town. A complex and a creek that did not match our names. A vacant industrial site and a waterway that matched the alert's geography well enough that if you substituted our actual names for the ones in the message, the instructions made geographic sense. I sat down in my shop chair and thought about that for a while. The cancellation came through 40 minutes after the original alert. That was a normal enough timeline that I did not initially think much about it. Doug put out the clarifying statement. The local community groups that had been buzzing with questions quieted down as people accepted the targeting error explanation. By the end of the evening, the alert had become a minor local footnote, the kind of thing people would mention briefly for a few days and then let go. I kept thinking about it. I called a contact I had at the State Emergency Management Office in Frankfurt, a woman named Pat, who had been in state emergency management for 20 years and who had always been willing to talk through technical questions with me. I told her about the alert and the cancellation explanation, and I asked her a question I was not sure how to answer myself, which was whether a cross-county targeting error of that distance was common. She said targeting errors happened occasionally, but that sending an alert 40 miles from its intended area was unusual. She said the targeting parameters in the system generally required a direct geographic specification that made it difficult to accidentally send an alert that far off course without someone catching it in the drafting stage before the message went out. I asked her how long it typically took for a targeting error to be caught and a cancellation issued. She said it depended on when the issuing office became aware of the error. If they caught it immediately, cancellation came fast. If they did not catch it right away, it could take longer. I said, what if the issuing office became aware of the error immediately, but the cancellation still took 40 minutes? She was quiet for a moment. She said that would be unusual. She said if you knew you had sent to the wrong area, you generally cancelled as fast as the system allowed, and the system allowed for faster than 40 minutes. I thanked her and hung up. 40 minutes was not a rapid correction. 40 minutes was long enough for most people who received the alert to read it and decide what to do about it, and either follow the instructions or not. You did not need 40 minutes to cancel a targeting error you had caught immediately. Someone had waited. The following Saturday morning, I drove out to the old plant site on the Hardin Road for the first time since I was a teenager, when kids used to go out there on dares that nobody actually followed through on. I parked on the county road and got out and stood at the chain link fence and looked at the site. 6 acres of mostly flat land. The concrete foundation remnants of several structures visible through the scrub that had grown up in the 4 decades since the plant closed. No trespassing signs at intervals along the fence. A county environmental services notice at the main gate indicating an ongoing assessment of the property. The specific quality of a place that has been left alone long enough that nature has started to reclaim it but has not yet finished. I stood there for a few minutes and thought about what had been manufactured there, a category of agricultural chemicals that were widely used in the mid-20th century and that were no longer manufactured because of what later research had established about what they did to soil and water over extended periods. Then I drove to the eastern part of town and parked near Mill Branch and walked along the bank for about 20 minutes. The water looked normal. The creek bank looked normal. A cool March morning, the creek running higher than usual from the winter precipitation, everything appearing exactly as a small waterway in western Kentucky in March was supposed to appear. I could not tell anything from looking at it. I was an electrician and a radio operator, not an environmental scientist. And even an environmental scientist standing on that bank would not have been able to tell anything without laboratory analysis. What I was doing was not scientific. I was checking the geography. I was asking whether the site and the creek were related in the way that the Harwell Industrial Complex and Cutter Creek were related in the alert, which was to say, within the range where something mobilized at the industrial site could reach the waterway and travel through the residential areas downstream. They were. The distance and the topography were consistent. Whatever the alert was warning about in Caldwell County, if you mapped it onto Falcott's geography with the real names substituted for the names in the message, the mapping worked. I need to tell you about Helen, because Helen is the part of this account that made everything else fall into place. Helen was in her late 70s and had lived her entire life in the eastern part of Falcott, in the same house on the same street that her parents had lived in, a house that sat about 3 blocks from Mill Branch. I had known her my whole life, the way you knew everyone in a town of 2,200 people, well enough to wave from the car and to stop and talk when you ran into each other. Not intimately, but with the comfortable familiarity of long mutual presence in the same small community. I went to see her on a Sunday afternoon, about a week after the alert. She made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table, and I told her what I had been thinking about, the targeting error explanation and why it did not fully satisfy me, the geography of the plant site and Mill Branch, the 40-minute wait before the cancellation. I laid it out in the order it had assembled in my own thinking, and she listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she said she wanted to ask me something before she said anything else. She asked if I had ever heard of Bad Creek nights. I said I had not. She nodded once, slowly, like she had expected that answer. She said that people in the eastern part of Falcott, the people who had lived near Mill Branch for a long time, had always known about certain nights when you stayed inside with the windows closed and you did not drink the tap water and you did not let the children play in the backyard. She said her mother had known about it and her grandmother before her, and she had grown up with it as simply part of living in that part of town, the same way you grew up knowing which neighbors had dogs and which streets flooded in heavy rain. Practical knowledge that you inherited without necessarily having a full explanation attached to it. I asked how people knew when a Bad Creek night was coming. She said, you learn to read the signs. A certain faint smell from the direction of the creek, not strong, just a particular wrongness in the air that people who were paying attention would catch before anyone who was not paying attention would notice anything. A quality to the water in the creek in the late afternoon light, something in the way it looked that she had never been able to describe precisely, but that her mother had pointed out to her when she was a girl, and that she had been able to recognize ever since. She said the old-timers, people who had worked at or near the plant during its operating years, had been the first ones to understand what the signs were connected to and had established the practice of staying in on those nights. They had understood the relationship between what happened at the plant site and what came through the creek afterward. They had passed down the practice to their families and neighbors without always passing down the full explanation, because the full explanation was not something they could prove to anyone who was not already paying attention, and it was not something that any official body was going to acknowledge, regardless. I asked her how often Bad Creek nights happened. She said a few times a year when conditions were right. She said she had never fully understood what conditions triggered them, only that she knew the signs when she saw them and she went inside. I said, the alert that came through on Thursday evening, the one that told everyone to shelter in place and not use tap water and not open windows or exterior doors. Does that match what you would do on a bad creek night? She said yes. She said it matched exactly. Then she said something that I have been thinking about ever since. She said she had not needed the alert on that particular Thursday. She had been watching the creek from her back window that afternoon, and she had seen the signs, and she had already closed her windows and was already planning to stay in. She said she followed the alert's instructions, not because the alert told her to, but because she had already decided to. And the alert arriving was the first time in her entire life that the official system had said anything that matched what she and her family had known in that part of Falcott for as long as anyone could trace it back. She said she was glad the alert had come. Not for herself, for the people on her street who had moved there in the last 10 or 20 years and who had no idea what she was talking about when she said bad creek nights. The people who would not have stayed inside without an official alert telling them to. The people who needed the emergency alert system tone on every device they owned before they took it seriously. She said those people had needed it. She said she was glad someone had sent it. About 3 weeks after my conversation with Helen, I reached back out to Pat at the state office. I asked her whether she could look into whether the Caldwell County Emergency Management Office had a history of issuing alerts that were subsequently identified as targeting errors. She called me back a few days later. She said Caldwell County's alert system showed no record of having issued the alert that went to our county on that Thursday in March. I said that could not be right, because Doug had told me the alert originated from Caldwell County, and the cancellation had been issued through their office. She said the cancellation was issued through Caldwell County's system, but the originating credentials on the original alert did not correspond to any active authorized originator in Caldwell County or in any of the surrounding counties. The administrative team for the alert system had reviewed the credential record and identified what they were calling a credential anomaly in the original issuance. The investigation was ongoing. I sat with that for a long moment. A credential anomaly meant the alert had come from somewhere. It had traveled through the official emergency alert system using credentials that were valid enough to get through the system's authentication, but that did not match any authorized originator in the region. Whoever sent the alert had access they should not have had, or had access through a channel that the system's administrators could not immediately account for. Someone outside the normal chain of authorized originators had sent that alert to Falcott. Someone who knew about Mill Branch and the old plant site and the Bad Creek nights had used whatever access they had to the emergency alert system to make sure the people in the eastern part of Falcott had official instructions on a Thursday evening in March when the signs were showing in the creek. They had sent it through the highest visibility channel available, the one that reached every device simultaneously, the one that people were conditioned to take seriously, and they had waited 40 minutes before issuing the cancellation to give the instructions time to register and time for people to act on them. I talked to Doug again, about 2 months after the alert. I was careful about how much I told him directly, but I asked him what his current understanding of the alert's origin was, now that the initial investigation had had some time to develop. He said the more he had looked into it, the less confident he was in the Caldwell County targeting error explanation. He said he had gotten the same credential anomaly finding that I had gotten from Pat, and he had filed a report with the state, and the state had told him the investigation was continuing without giving him a timeline or a preliminary conclusion. I asked him if he thought the alert had been a genuine targeting error. He was quiet for a moment. He said he did not know any more. He said when it first happened, he had accepted the targeting error explanation because targeting errors happened and the explanation fit the surface of the situation. He said looking at the technical details had changed his assessment. I asked him what he thought the right explanation was. He said he thought someone had wanted the people near Mill Branch to have the warning and had found a way to put it through the official system because the official system was the one thing that reached every device simultaneously and that could not be ignored the way any other channel could be ignored. He said he did not know who that someone was or how they had the access they clearly had. He said whatever the explanation was, nobody in Falkirk had been hurt, and the instructions in the alert were the right instructions for the situation based on everything he was now learning about the plant site and the creek. He said he had been in contact with the State Environmental Office about a formal assessment of the old plant site and its relationship to the Mill Branch watershed. I said that was the right call and I meant it. He said he knew. He said he should have made it years ago, and he was making it now. It has been 6 months since that Thursday evening in March. The state environmental assessment of the plant site is ongoing. The investigation into the alert's origin has not been closed with a satisfying explanation, and I do not expect it to be, because the answer to how the alert was issued points toward someone having access they should not have had. And that kind of answer tends to get surrounded by official process without ever being fully resolved. Helen is still in her house, 3 blocks from Mill Branch. She told me recently that she had sat down with her daughter, who lives 2 streets over, and had the conversation about bad creek nights that she had been putting off for years, the full version, with the signs and the practice and the history of it, going back through her mother and her grandmother to the people who worked at the plant and first understood what they were seeing in the water. She said she had been waiting until her daughter was ready to hear it without dismissing it, and she thought her daughter was ready now. She said she was not going to let the knowledge stop with her. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The transmission, the way certain knowledge moved through a community over time, not through official channels and not through deliberate instruction necessarily, but through the accumulated practice of people who knew what to do and did it and were present enough in the lives of the next generation that something passed even when the full explanation did not. Helen's grandmother had the full explanation, having lived through the plant's operating years and understood the connection firsthand. The explanation had faded across the generations. The practice had remained. The alert was someone else's version of keeping the practice alive. Someone who had access to the official system and who knew about Falkirk and Mill Branch and Bad Creek nights had sent the warning through the highest visibility channel available in the language of civil emergency management, because that was the language the system required and the language that reached people who had not inherited the knowledge through family and neighborhood. They had sent it to the people who needed it, and they had waited long enough before canceling for the instructions to do their work. I do not know who sent it. I have spent 6 months thinking about who might have had the access and the local knowledge and the motivation, and I have not arrived at anyone I can name with confidence. What I have arrived at is the understanding that whoever sent it had been watching out for Falcott in a way that Falcott did not know it was being watched out for, and that the watching had been specific enough and the access had been real enough that when the Thursday evening came and the signs were showing in the creek, they were able to do something about it. Someone went to considerable trouble to get that warning to the people near Mill Branch on that particular evening. I have spent 6 months trying to figure out who I am grateful to. I have not gotten there. What I have gotten to is this. I want to say something to anyone reading this who lives in a small town and receives an emergency alert that seems wrong in specific ways. Not randomly wrong, but wrong in the way of an alert that references places that do not exist under your local names, but that correspond to things that do exist in your local geography under different names. Do not dismiss it automatically as a targeting error. Read the instructions. Think about whether those instructions, stripped of the specific location names that do not match, describe something that applies to where you actually are. Think about whether there is an industrial site or a waterway or some other feature of your local geography that corresponds to what the alert is warning about, even if the names are not the same. If you have older residents who have lived in the same part of town for a long time, the kind of people who carry the accumulated practical knowledge of a place the way Helen carries it, talk to them. Not necessarily about the alert. Ask them about the land. Ask them about the things that old-timers in your community knew to do or not do in certain places at certain times. In my experience, the communities that have something to know have found ways to carry the knowing, even when the explanation got lost along the way, and the older residents are where that carrying lives. I'm not saying that every misrouted alert is a deliberate warning from someone with special knowledge of a local hazard. Most targeting errors are targeting errors, and the system makes mistakes that are exactly what they look like. I am saying that the one that came to Falcott was not a mistake, and the only way I knew it was not a mistake was because I took it seriously, long enough to look at the geography and sit with Helen and ask the questions that led me to what I found. Someone went to significant trouble to send that warning to the people near Mill Branch. They used credentials that should not have existed to route a message through a system that reaches every device simultaneously, and they gave people 40 minutes to read the instructions and act on them before the cancellation went out. Whatever they did it right, because that Thursday evening was a bad creek night, one of the worst ones in Helen's recent memory, and the people in the eastern part of Falcott who followed the alert's instructions, or who followed Helen's grandmother's practice, stayed inside with their windows closed and did not drink from the tap. None of them were hurt. The alert worked. Helen had already known it was coming before the alert arrived, because she had been watching Mill Branch that afternoon, and she had seen what she needed to see. But she told me she was glad the alert came anyway, glad for her neighbors who had moved to the east side of Falcott without understanding what the east side of Falcott had always carried, glad for the people who had no grandmother to learn from and no practice to inherit, and who needed the government tone on every device they owned before they would take an instruction seriously. Those people had the tone on Thursday evening in March. Someone made sure they did. I have been thinking about that person, or those people, for 6 months, about what it takes to maintain that kind of watch over a place, about how long the watching might have been going on, about whether the Thursday evening in March was the first time they had found a way to send the warning through the official system, or whether there were other nights in other years when someone in the eastern part of Falkot received an alert they dismissed as a mistake and followed the instructions anyway out of caution, or did not follow the instructions at all, about what that means for the nights that did not have a warning. I'm going to make sure Falkot does not need an unofficial alert from someone with unauthorized credentials the next time a bad creek night comes through. Helen is making sure her daughter has the knowledge. I am having conversations with the newer residents on the east side of town about the plant site and the creek and what the environmental assessment is finding. Doug is working with the state on a formal notification protocol for the Mill Branch watershed that will give people official guidance through legitimate channels. We are building the thing that should have been built 40 years ago when the plant closed, which is a community that knows what it is living alongside and knows what to do about it. The alert started that. An alert that came from somewhere outside the normal chain, issued by someone we cannot identify, using credentials that should not have existed, waited 40 minutes to cancel so that the instructions had time to land. It started something that should have been started a long time ago. I'm going to make sure it finishes.